Hey everyone, it's blog time, and today we're talking about what kind of record to make. An album, an EP, or a single. So, in this modern world of digital self-releases, most bands are operating without a label and without label guidance. So, when it comes to making a decision about what kind of record to release, what length of record, it can often be a stab in the dark with very little actual experience to back up your choices. But fear not, Russ is here with some words of wisdom. Well, hopefully, anyway. So today we're going to talk about the three major record types: albums, EPs, often called mini albums, and singles. So let's start at the thick end of the wedge, the album. The album is an art form, and it's something quite fantastic, and there are several key benefits to making an album. In the 80 minutes or more, depending on how you want to make an album, it's possible to really explore some interesting musical concepts to give your fans a real experience that they can sit down and listen to, maybe listen to on a long car journey. But the album offers fans great value for money and potentially significant savings per song released in terms of your manufacturing costs. If you choose to go down the physical route of making an album, making it, an LP or CD or whatever, it's great because you can include artwork and people still like to hold in their hands the booklets, the sleeves. Digital albums, of course, don't benefit so much from having all these songs lumped together, as they're often retailed for a fixed fee. So, in some cases it's better to split your record into multiple parts. More about that in a moment. So let's talk about recording, and of course tracking an album is a lot more expensive than tracking a single, but again, on a per song basis it usually costs significantly less. So nobody wants to listen to an album that sounds identical all the way through, so I would suggest taking precautions so you can add a different flavour to each track whilst maintaining a sort of a consistent core to the overall sonic. The cons, therefore, of making an album generally include increasing the cost for the recording and mixing and mastering stage. Although, as I say, it's generally cheaper per track. Some bands have a tendency to need to create filler songs if your band isn't quite ready for an album. So you've really got to be at that point. In fact, I generally suggest recording more songs and then picking the best ones to actually go forward onto the record. But of course, in this day and age, you have to ask yourself the question, do people listen to albums? Are they still listening to them? Well, it depends very much on the genre that you're specifically working in. If you're in the pop world, then albums might not be so much of a draw for your fans. However, if you are a technical death metal band or a prog band or something, then, the album can still be king. Let's talk about the EP. Or if you want to call it a mini album. Now, when I was growing up in the 90s, the EP usually had somewhere between 4 and 6 songs, though sometimes singles could have as many as 4 songs. More about that in a second. So if you want to class your record as a mini album, you're probably these days looking at somewhere between 5 and 8 songs, or tracks, however you want to think of it. So EPs seem to be very popular these days in the sort of digital download generation, and it gives enough time for artists to develop conceptual ideas and convey a message, the aesthetic, the feeling towards their audience. It gives the audience the sense that they're buying a full record rather than just a single, but it's not too large a project for most independent bands to tackle. In terms of cost of recording, EPs are generally obviously less than doing a whole album, and they're still more cost effective per track than doing a single, and you can get this consistency of sound, maybe track 4 to 8 songs in one recording block, one session, and the audience doesn't get tired of that sound during the duration of the record like they might with an album. So one thing I quite often do with clients who've planned to release, say, 2 EPs over the next 6 to 12 months period, is I'll track all the rhythm parts, the drums, the bass, the rhythm guitars, of both EPs in one session. It might be several day session, but we keep the equipment set up, and the tracks we want to use on the second EP will immediately go into storage. We'll archive them and deal with them at a later date while we work on the first EP, overdubs and so on. Now this gives the artist an economy of scale, similar to working on an album, but it allows them to work on tracks in a more financially viable chunk. It's quite amazing how much tracking you can actually do once your equipment is set up, once you're on a roll, so to speak. I mean, recording drums, bass, rhythm, guitars, for example, as a rhythm section can be done very effectively. So, what are the cons of an EP? Well, sometimes people consider them to be albums. They think of them as albums, and then they're disappointed because they're not as long as they were hoping. But generally in this day and age, most independent music fans will accept the EP as the standard format for an independent band releasing records. So, as I say, when I was younger, yes, during the 90s, many of my favourite bands actually released EPs. They started off with EPs, and of course we didn't really make a fuss about it then. We just sort of really thought of them as a record. One thing I'd recommend for independent artists launching an EP, though, is to refer to them as a record. Now, that might confuse your hipster who's into vinyls. Yeah, okay, that's for another day. But it generally creates a more professional feeling than using the term EP, which in recent years has become synonymous with like home recorded crappy basement bands and Poundland microphones. There's nothing wrong with Poundland microphones when used for effect, but you get what I'm saying. So let's talk about the single. So the single is almost the pinnacle of launchability. By releasing singles, you have great press opportunities for press coverage. And a lot of the acts I work with these days actually release an EP and then individually take the tracks of that EP and release them as singles every few months from that one record. One great idea is to make a music video for each of the singles, and it keeps the press interested. Bloggers are always looking for new videos and releases to review, and it gives the fans something to look forward to if there's a new music video every 6 weeks or month or whatever. So in terms of recording, singles can become very, very, very expensive. But let's put it this way. I regularly work with one rock band who are quite willing to spend an album budget, what I consider to be an album budget for a small band, per single. And when I say single, I mean a single track. So it seems to have become the trend these days to sort of eschew the B-side, to forget that. But the B-side can be quite a powerful device. It lets us extend the concept of the single somewhat, sonically or thematically. I usually suggest like a stripped down version or a radio edit or a remix or an acoustic track for the B-side. Now, again, remember when you record multiple songs or tracks together in a single recording block, a single recording session, whether it's one day or many days, your cost per track drastically drops. It's the setup time which is the huge expense, really, when recording in small sessions. Either in terms of quality and time that you spend if you're recording in a home studio or your own studio, or just like per day cost if you're in a commercial facility. You'll get a better sound in a commercial facility, but there are those overheads. So it's quite common I'll record 90% of a single in a large commercial studio and move back to my smaller mix room for vocals, overdubs. I've got a live area as well, but you can use the sort of remaining hours in your big studio to cut B-sides or try them as well. Maybe after dinner when the band are refreshed and they're sort of, wanting to do something in the evening if you work late. Of course, the cons of recording a single are primarily cost and continuity. If you're working with a different producer, engineer or mastering engineer each time, you get to experiment with different sonics, which is great on a sort of per track basis. But your fans, when they're listening to your singles, will want some kind of consistency off their playlist of your band or your act. So that's where mastering can be quite useful. So it's not uncommon when I get tracks to master and not worked with the artist before, I'll try and match it, but improve on it off the previous single, make it better, but sort of within the same vibe. So before I sum up, I want to talk about one thing, the bonus feature. You weren't expecting this, and that's kind of my point. The bonus track, you can release that to your hardcore fans via mailing lists, secret tweets, competitions. It's great fun. And there's many interesting approaches to digital downloads undertaken by artists. There's even a live product, a standalone system that some artists use to set up a Wi-Fi network at their gigs. so their fans can download at the gig either codes or the actual bonus content. It could be a mix of the show. So for bonus content, think outside the box. Maybe release your tracks that didn't quite fit into your records. Your fans will appreciate it. But remember, in these contexts, that you need to make sure your tracks are up to standard. Don't just release anything. Releasing substandard recordings is very dangerous. So that brings me to the end of our discussion about different types of releases. The album, the mammoth release that sees the breakup of so many bands. It's a huge financial burden, but can be incredibly profitable and incredibly rewarding. The EP is becoming a little cliche, but it's perfect for the current market, and I suggest most people make EPs these days. And the single, the media whore's ideal release. It might not earn you as much money per record, and it might cost more, but the scope for new fans, press coverage and music videos is exponentially higher. So with that, let's move forward and make our next release appropriate to our fan base, our intended future fan base, our aesthetic and our musical intent, and ideally appropriate to our budgets. Happy recording, I'll see you next time.